in the world. So if you look at a lot of literature, if you look at a lot of speeches from the times of decolonization, if you go back and look at the grand parades, if you listen to the music, it was very optimistic that Africa was going to emerge as a world power. And John Henry Clark in his research said that even the European colonizers and even the United States, they had pretty much come to terms where they said they're going to have to sit down and negotiate with Africans. They're going to have to allow Africans to come to the table and negotiate with them, and maybe may have to, operate on Africa's terms. But now in 2020, we see that shit, all of that potential was absolutely wasted. And there were several things that happened. I mean, there are books written on it, but I'll just list some of the major things. Number one, the borders. Dale Jones would always talk about this. Africa, after decolonization, they decolonized politically, but they didn't decolonize geographically. So that's why you had a lot of tensions. Just I think about 4 or 5 years ago, you had the Luos and the Kikuyus in Kenya beating the shit out of each other, and you got the Eritreans, the Oromo, and the Amharic people beating the shit out of each other. You got the Muslims and the Yoruba in Nigeria beating the shit out of each other. You just had all these fucking internal conflicts. I don't even have to say, how could I forget the Hutus and the Tutsis? Because the colonial borders had no respect to African nations, African cultures, African interests. All of the borders on Africa under colonization and in 2020 were drawn for them to maximize the exploitation of Africa and to minimize the conflict between the colonial powers, not to minimize the conflict between Africans and Africans. They should have redrawn the borders, or as Kwame Nkrumah was trying to do, erase the borders, not even redraw them, but to erase the borders, to erase them and have a unified African continent and the United Nations of Africa or United States of Africa. That was his goal, which is why the CIA had to overthrow him. So the geography of colonization remained, even though the politics of colonization were supposed to be outed. Number two, the economic system. Europe had set economic priorities for Africa during colonization. They pushed everything from mono agriculture, and basically the African continent was an extractive and export economy. It was not an internal development economy. All of the railroads, all of the roads were all led to ports to extract Africa's wealth. And Africans had fallen into this rut of exporting, sending everything we had abroad, and then buying finished products from abroad. So we'll send you the coltan, and then you ship in phones. We'll send you the oil, and you'll send us back refined crude fuel. So they never really broke that cycle of export, which again, could have been played to Africa's benefit, but again, it was also capitalistic. Also, that's another one. I mean, there's so many reasons, but also many of the European white migrants were not only allowed to remain in Africa, but to hold on to the land and everything they got, all of their ill-gotten gains in Africa. They were essentially in limbo or dual citizens. So, and I know everybody knows about South Africa and the white minority in South Africa, but that's not the only place. And it wasn't just Europeans. So like Zimbabwe, everybody was praising Mugabe for his land reform because 80% of the arable land in Zimbabwe was owned by white farmers who murdered Africans. They're literally Europeans, and Truth and Reconciliation, oh, there's so much. But anyway, I just try to condense this. And Truth and Reconciliation is another reason why Africa suffered. Failure to seek vengeance and seek justice for the atrocities. That's another reason. But in Zimbabwe, Mugabe was in power for 30 years and allowed white people to essentially rule the economy. There was only one African leader, because not even Nkrumah, the great Pan-Africanist, not even Nkrumah kicked out the Asians and the whites. There's only one African leader that says, if you are a colonizer, you can't own land here. You can't even fucking live here. Pack your shit and get the blood clot out. Was Idi Amin. When Idi Amin rose to power in Uganda, the majority, 70 to 90% of the economy, depending on the region, was controlled by Europeans and Southeast Asians. Idi Amin said, all of y'all pack y'all fucking bags and get the fuck out. And then you have everybody that came to our soil through invasion has to leave. And if you want to migrate back, then you have to do just like y'all make us do when our people want to come to you. Fill out immigration form, you submit, we want to know your records, we want to know your history, we want to know your capacity, your skill level, your accounts, we want to know everything before you can come back. Idi Amin was the only African leader to rise to power. All these other Mugabe killing and was talking all that big shit, but he let the white people run his country, his economy, while he was running around in private jets and limos and big billion-dollar entourages. Same thing under Mobutu Sese Seko. He talked all this big shit and walked around in these military uniforms while white folks were still there running his economy. So Idi Amin was the only one. But after Idi Amin got disposed, slowly the people came back. And the New York Times wrote articles. That's where I learned about most of this. They wrote a lot of articles about how the Asians came back to reclaim their land, reclaim their property. So that's another reason. I mean, there's so many reasons. Essentially, the bottom line is Africa got recolonized, neocolonialism, because the revolutionary leaders who liberated Africa were not the ones who were allowed to govern Africa. I'd say that's the main reason. The same thing here. The revolutionary leaders who led the Black liberation struggle were not the people who rose to power. Look at it this way. Let's say that I go to Europe. I'm a man who runs a nation and I'm very powerful. And I colonize Europe. And then Europeans rise up to fight and say, give us our rights. And I say, fine. And they don't, and then they negotiate with me. But then they allow me to pick the Europeans I want to negotiate with. So I'm going to pick left-leaning liberals. Like if I could pick the leader for America, I'd pick fucking Noam Chomsky or somebody. You know, if I could pick the leader of Israel, I'd put Norman Finkelstein in charge of Israel. I wouldn't pick somebody to govern in the interest of the nation. Really, I would, because I mean, shit. But you get my drift. So the problem is that the Europeans, when they were forced through guerrilla warfare, through negotiation, through protracted struggle to have to make concessions to Africans or in the African diaspora, we allowed them to say who they will negotiate with and who they will distribute those concessions to. So all over the black world, in the United States, in Europe, everywhere you find populations of black people, the Caribbean, African, the Europeans handpicked our black leaders. So that's another reason. So there are so many reasons as to why they fail. And that's why we have to be revolutionary. It's not enough to be even competent or hardworking or organized. We got to be revolutionary. We have to be revolutionary, and meaning that, you can't replace, and in some regions, literally, there's a really good book called Who Betrayed the African Movement, where literally the colonial officer was sitting at his desk and he stood up from the desk and the new African officer sat right back down. And replacing a European colonial governor with an African elected official was no different than replacing a white cop with a black cop. No different. Or your gang being terrorized, your neighborhood being terrorized by the Hells Angels, or being terrorized by the Bloods and the Crips. I mean, which is fucking better? Essentially, a lot of times, more times, all the time, you have the same fucking outcome. So, I mean, there's not one reason that Africa fell back to neocolonialism, but I don't want you to despair about Africa under colonialism, because Africa spent the shortest amount of time under direct colonialism than any other population. Ireland was colonized by the British for what, 800 years? Even the Romans were colonizing other white people for like 1600 years. So white people's colonial history is longer than Africa's. And throughout the colonial histories, it has never been absolute colonization, and it has never been a comfortable or easy colonization. There has always been resistance, failed resistance and successful resistance. So when you look at it, I feel optimistic about Africa's capacity to be liberated and black people's capacity to be liberated in general. But what really gives me despair is that I don't think the world will be, the system of capitalism has the capacity to destroy the life, has the ability to destroy the life-sustaining capacity of the earth. So the earth won't be around. The earth can't wait for us to go along this long drawn-out path towards ultimate liberation, destruction of global white domination and capitalism, dismantling of their war machines, their nuclear silos. The world can't wait for us to tear all that shit down, because the ocean will be acidic, the polar ice caps will melt, the large predatory and herd species are all going fucking extinct. So it used to be, you could sit there and say, it's not a matter of if, it's only a matter of when. That's what Kwame Ture said. Africa will have its freedom. That's what he would always say. Africa will have her freedom. It's not a matter of if, but when. But the when window is this. Before, back in the 60s, you could say, okay, it might take us another 100 years, but we getting there. We ain't got 30 years to get free from this shit before they fucking make the world uninhabitable. And they try to go into some underwater, under ocean bunker or set up a fucking space station, satellite on Mars and shit, because the earth can't be inhabited by living creatures anymore because of their greed and psychopathy. I don't know how I got over there from where I am. What's up, Chauncey? Do you think these latest reopened protests are astroturf? Because that's what it seems like. Every white movement in this country is astroturf. The Tea Party movement, the militia movement,